find, that is, in other words, there is something else, and I'll come to what I think that something else is. There are similar legends and myths in many parts of the world, all of which get read through Oedipus. That's one strand. I've talked about the way psychoanalysis, and I'll come a little bit more to that, about how in the Global South it's more confidently owned. But there's also that other strand which tries to match which social sciences are more familiar with. Was there feudalism in India? You know, that kind of question. So I'm looking at the was there feudalism in India kind of question now through Oedipus for a moment. So the absence of Oedipus tales, and therefore of an Oedipus complex, can also be seen as a lack. It's like a permanent prison you're in. If you don't have an Oedipus tale, it's a sign of repression. It's a lack, and it prevents this is what prevents the emergence of Indians into full maturity and modernity. It could be read like this. So a scholar like A.K. Ramanujan, he embarks on the project of finding what he calls Oedipus-like patterns in Indian myth and folklore, keeping Sophocles' Oedipus Rex as the model. And what happens is that the universality of this primal parricide and guilt is assumed to such an extent that Oedipus can be sought and found everywhere. So there's a volume I came across, for example, which is a search for Oedipus in global folklore. And it finds Oedipus everywhere. Albania, Hungary, Papua, in the late, early to the late 20th century. I'll tell you what's the problem with. They're not actually Oedipus stories. They are stories, different kinds of stories of incest. Father and son having sex. Mother having sex with her son unknowingly. Mother having sex with her son because she desires him. There are multiple kinds of stories of incest. And they all get put into a volume called Oedipus in Folklore. A.K. Ramanujan found what he calls 8 variants in India. There are 8 different unusual stories, but because his project is to not be found lacking in the proper maturity that an Oedipus story promises, he looks for these stories, he finds 8 variants, and in all the variants, as he himself points out, the protagonist is the woman. And he puts it like this: the men are pawns in the story of women's fate. Again, in many of the stories that the volume tells, the father is entirely absent or already dead, or the father kills the son, so the parricide is not a theme at all. So it seems to me that Oedipus Rex of Sophocles and his whole obsession is actually one version of the preoccupation of human societies with incest, in which one could see many other themes being triggered. For instance, I think one of the key themes is the gradual delegitimation of matrilineal societies and replacement by patrilineal. And such a process would not have been free of violence. There would have been a great deal of violence in the transformation, in this transformation. And the emergence of the incest taboo almost from the moment that incest is confronted as such, and the taboo comes into being for a variety of reasons, perhaps wider alliances, perhaps avoidance of familial conflict. But when read through the Freudian Oedipus template, all these complex narratives about incest that suggest historical changes and shifts are understood simply as either reversals of the original Oedipus story or as different versions of the original, so-called original Sophocles telling, although really many being oral tellings may be older than Sophocles'. Ramanujan's essay in this volume recounts and participates in the Oedipal interpretation by scholars such as Goldman of conflicts between Brahmin sages and Kshatriya rulers in the epics and in temple legends. The Brahmin is read as the father, the Kshatriya as the son in such interpretations, with the son using these battles for supremacy. But to impute a trans-historical, primal, familial frame to a historical process in which one social group is establishing control over others through violence, alliance building, and hegemonizing narratives is the equivalent of understanding capitalist transformation in England in terms of Oedipal conflict. So that's one kind of way in which just 5 minutes, yes. So this is one kind of way in which one can look at psychoanalysis in the global south, which is where you try to match original narrative and the real thing, as it were. But as I said, actually there are multiple ways in which it's owned and replayed. I gave you one example of the Ajase complex, but a significant development in the field, and now I look more closely, more at India, significant development in the field appears to be the claim that the South is not merely different, but the claim is that what is considered the specificity of the South may in fact be universalizable globally. So it's one thing to say that the universal doesn't fit us, and we are a special case. It's another thing to say we have some conceptual, I think Professor Kabiraj said that in the context of aesthetic theory, that there are some concepts that can be universalized in the other direction. So now the claim, and we find this in both in Japanese psychoanalysis and in Indian, that the specificity of the South may be universalizable globally, that something presented as a counter to Western notions of the self is not peculiar to that particular culture alone, but has more universal valence. So for example, there is this concept of amae, the Japanese concept of amae, which was first written by a Japanese psychiatrist called Takeo Doi, and amae roughly corresponds to dependency need, or basking in another's indulgence. And this has a lot to do with the mother-child relationship as well. And the interesting trend here is that Japanese scholars have been for some time arguing that amae is not to be conflated with attachment or dependence. In other words, it's not a pathological feature, but it is, and it's not unique to Japanese culture. The claim is that this particular mode of being in which you seek a kind of oneness with the other, and you seek another's indulgence, is possibly universal, and you can find amae behaviors in parts of the global north as well. So the playful acts of childlike dependence in a romantic relationship, for example, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Similarly, from India, Anup Dhar reads Giridhar Bose's contribution and his correspondence with Freud as more than an argument for cultural relativism. He's saying more than Indian and European patients are different. Rather, as Anup Dhar puts it, India is an analyst of the European obsession with the phallus and the edible as the structuring principle of psychic constitution. So the way he puts it is India as the analyst rather than the analysand. That is, India performing analysis on Europe. So Anup Dhar, whom many of us know, is part of a collective institutional project begun in 2009 at Ambedkar University, Delhi, in which psychoanalysis is not about psychological interiority and the confessional attitude of classical Freudian psychoanalysis, but about groups and community. So Hani Oberoi Bahari, who is also a key founder of the initiative, calls it psychosocial clinical studies. That is, the individual does not come alone to the clinic. The individual comes as an entangled mass of communal memory and traces. So she actually puts it like this, that the psychotherapist becomes a co-sufferer, participant, or a co-vulnerable expert. So psychoanalysis from the global south, rather than psychoanalysis in the global south, seeks to speak to such experiences located elsewhere than the south too, which do not fit into mainstream Western psychoanalytic and conceptual frameworks.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Swami Prakash Chaudhary.